What if you woke up every day to an old, unwanted apartment in a ghetto neighborhood, just because of the color of your skin? And every day, as you make your way to school, you have to look around every few seconds to make sure no one was going to mug you. And as you return to bed each night, you can hear your parents' worried whispers through the paper-thin walls about how much harder it is to stay afloat when no one gives jobs to blacks anymore. This was the situation for many African Americans living in Chicago in the early 1900s. Now, after years of dissatisfaction and frustration, the darker-skinned citizens of Chicago have started to plan their change. In the summer of 1966, after years of unfair and occasionally extreme treatment from their Caucasian neighbors, many African Americans living in Chicago decided to take a stand against what they believed was an unfair barrier that made it nearly impossible for them to afford better and suitable living spaces. During their nonviolent protests for civil rights, the African Americans were met with hatred-filled and hostile mobs of whites that feared a change to their racial cliches. Though there were many tragedies that came with this protest, the activists still managed to end triumphantly in getting the government to see the judgment and discrimination they faced. The oppression these people faced and what they did to amend it eventually reached the eyes and ears of Congress and inspired many other places in America to follow their lead. Around the early 1920s, the Great Migration, also known as the Great Northward Migration, began. It moved around 6 million African Americans from the southern states to northern cities like Chicago. Most, if not all, were hoping to find some better jobs to support their families. At first, the arrival of the African Americans were seen as somewhat of a bountiful source of cheap labor for the big companies. But as the population of the African Americans in the North increased, the job demand slowly but surely decreased with it. And on top of all that, the racial prejudice that the whites had against the blacks were starting to create a tension that started off with just a biased opinion on the difference of skin color to a split in the two major sides of Chicago.
You had a tremendous influx of people who came during the war and right after the war from the South. You see, because the invention of the cotton picker literally demobilized millions of people, black and white, the hillbillies and all, began to leave the South and come north, and they came to the cities where they thought they could find jobs.
The split between the two ethnic groups soon became increasingly obvious. In the summer of 1966, African Americans from the Chicago West Side started speaking up for themselves in hopes of fairer pay and housing so that they too were able to live in comfortable neighborhoods. The conflict soon reached the ears of the SCLC, also known as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and their president, the famed Martin Luther King Jr.
We plan to stir up trouble in some of the big cities in our country this summer. But my stirring up trouble will be righteous trouble to bring about nonviolent solutions. There is no doubt about the despair in the Negro community, and I don't think we deal with that despair by doing nothing. We've got to have outlets through which people can channelize their legitimate discontent.
On July 10, 1966, he delivered a 12-page speech at a civil rights rally located at Soldier Field that earned the support of the Chicagoan African Americans, who longed for better employment opportunities and education for their children. All was going well until a few days before the first organized protest. A man named Richard Speck sexually harassed and murdered 8 female student nurses from the South Chicago Community Hospital, And in the same week, Chicago police shot and killed 2 black Chicagoans during riots on the predominantly black West Side. These events stirred some doubts from both the protesters and the government officials in the city.
And certainly there has to be some machinery set up in order that you don't go from just one type of citizen to another.
But King insisted that the march must go on. The first march was on July 16, 1966, and consisted of 120 demonstrators that walked from Englewood into Marquette Park for a picnic. It wasn't until almost 2 weeks later, on Thursday, July 28, 1966, when protesters began an all-night vigil at 63rd Street and Kensington Avenue at a realty company that systematically discriminated against black buyers looking to move into Gage Park, that the demonstrators were faced with a major conflict. White counter-demonstrators appeared, and by nightfall, Chicago police struck a deal for the lawful open housing protesters to be filed into paddy wagons for a safe escort back to the ghetto.
The first marches were into Gage Park and Marquette Park. They began with just individuals, couples, white and black persons, going to real estate offices and asking for services. And when the blacks would be refused, as they were every time, there would be vigils outside the office with signs saying this office discriminates and so forth. When those were set upon by crowds, young men with sticks and clubs, we decided that we'd at least be a moving target, and we turned the vigils into marches.
On July 30th, 1966, about 250 open housing protesters, still furious about what happened the night before, returned to the same Southwest Side intersection. There, they were met by bottles and rocks thrown by whites. The protesters had to retreat again to the east of Ashland Avenue into Englewood. When demonstrators marched out of Englewood again on July 31st, more than 500 whites met them as they crossed Ashland Avenue onto 63rd Street. Armed with cherry bombs, rocks, bricks, and bottles, the ever-growing mob of anti-demonstrators started burning cars and injured around 50 open occupancy protesters, including a first-grade teacher hit by a projectile. The brutality in the event was so horrendously violent that even King himself said,
Well, this is a terrible thing. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago.
In mid-August, high-level negotiations began between city leaders, movement activists, and representatives of the Chicago Real Estate Board. But it wasn't until August 26th, when the Chicago Freedom Movement had declared that it would march into Cicero, site of a fierce race riot in 1951, that positive steps to open up housing opportunities in urban Chicago were reached. All in all, the Chicago Freedom Movement protesters did reach their goal, and the courageous actions were not in vain. This movement is now acknowledged as one of the most ambitious civil rights campaigns in the northern United States and is credited to being one of the sole reasons for the existence of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which outlaws the refusal to sell or rent a dwelling to any person regarding race, color, disability, religion, sex, familial status, or national origin. Although the movement seemed like more of a tragedy at the time, it eventually led the way to a triumphant ending, which shows that even with the odds so against what the protesters were fighting for, their determination and years of hard work eventually paid off. Now, about 50 years later, colored people are much less discriminated against, and even though there is still the inevitable factor of violence and injustice from time to time, the two ethnic groups now live together in various and peaceful communities all around the United States. These civil rights supporters had to cross many seemingly indestructible barriers in their way, but still stood bravely to fight for the rights they believed they deserved and carved an inspiring path for others to follow their lead.